Welcome, everybody, to the first session of the Advanced or Experienced stream of the Joint Postal History Symposium, sponsored by the PHSC and the RPSC. We're very happy and pleased to have David D'Alessandris as our presenter today, who's going to be speaking about United States Pre-Confederation sea mail. And David is the immediate past president of the U.S. Philatelic Classics Society and is currently the vice president of the American Revenue Association. David is also the assistant section editor for Foreign Mail section of the USPCS Chronicle. His primary collecting interest is cross-border mail between the United States and Canadian maritime provinces. He's published a series of articles on the topic in the Chronicle, three of which were awarded the Susan M. McDonald Award for Best Article. He's also a winner of the Collectors Club of Chicago Pratt Award and the USPCS Distinguished Philatelist Award. In addition to the Chronicle, David has published articles in the American Philatelic Society's American Philatelist, American Revenue Association's American Revenuer, Western Cover Society's Western Express, the American Philatelic Congress Book, and the PHSC Journal. David is an occasional exhibitor, most recently showing off a single frame exhibit of Cunard mail between Halifax and the United States at New York 2016 and CAPEX 2022. The exhibit previously won the BNAP's Herb McNaught Single Frame Award. So David, welcome, and we'll turn it over to you.
Okay, let me bring up what happened. There we go. So is everybody seeing my screen now?
Yes, it's fine.
Okay. So when I was asked to give a presentation, I thought it would be interesting to cover the mail sent between Halifax and the US sent by sea. Usually when I'm looking at auction catalogs or exhibits or dealer stocks, when I see covers that are misdescribed or misinterpreted, a lot of times it's this type of mail. The mail sent by land is usually pretty easy to understand. The rates are simpler, and you have a few little twists here and there with like exchange rate surcharges or ferriage rates, but for the most part, they're fairly easy to follow. But the mail sent by sea is a little more complex, and so the sort of outline of what I'm covering here is there's mail sent by favor, ship letters. Then we have the organized routes, the Falmouth packet, the Cunard mail boats, the Cunard line, the Sir John Harvey, the North Atlantic Steam Navigation Company, which only was a couple trips, the Boston and Colonial Steamship Company, and then the International Steamship Line. Prior to 1788, there were no actual postal routes between Nova Scotia and the United States, and there wasn't a road until 1817, so there was no land mail route until then. And so at any time you could send letters by favor of someone, some traveler heading in the right direction, and you'd give them the letter and ask them to, drop it in the mail when they got close to your destination. This was primarily used in the 1700s before we had, the established mail routes, but even into the 1850s, people would carry mail, carry letters out of the postal stream to save money. Often refer to them as being bootleg letters. If you were sending a letter from, say, London to New York, if you could have somebody carry the letter on the steamship, it would cost you a penny to drop it in the mail in New York instead of 24 cents, a shilling, if it was to go through the post office. And so here's just a couple examples of favor mail. This is a a pre-Revolutionary War letter. So it's not a cross-border letter because there was no border then. But this is 1751, and you'll see it's noted to the care of Mr. John Powell, meaning it was carried by favor of Mr. Powell, who mailed it in Boston. And there's let me see if I can get there. This B is the Boston postmark, and it was rated 2 shillings 6 pence, which is the Massachusetts old tenor currency, which was, just the equivalent of, I think it was 4 pence sterling. This letter sent, 3 years before there was a post office in Halifax. Here's another example of mail being carried by favor. This is from New York in 1782, which was during the British occupation. And it was probably carried from New York to Halifax by military couriers. They were known to carry mail for the clergy, and if you look, it's addressed to the Reverend Mr. Bailey by care of Mr. Weeks of Halifax. Obviously, this was during a period of censorship, and in the letter it talks about the great peace at present here in New York. So they knew it was going to be read. A little more related to postal uses, if you could send ship letters. And so basically ship captains sailing in the right direction would carry mail. And so you didn't typically carry the letters down to the dock, but there was typically a coffee house or a tavern or something nearby the port, and they'd have bags there. And you'd say, well, I need to send a letter to New York. What ships are sailing soon and willing to, carry letters for us? And you'd pick, the ship heading in the right direction and closest in time and closest to the destination you wanted. And so the ship captains, when they arrived in port, they had to deliver the letters to the post office before they were allowed to unload their ship. And so there's no contract between the ship and the post office, but this was the way a lot of mail was sent, up into the 1830s and even later. The use became less frequent after about 1851. And so these are the ship letter rates in the US, and then the ship letter rates going into Halifax and well, actually it would be anywhere in Nova Scotia or New Brunswick. And so here's a simple example. Here's a letter from Halifax in November of 1824, sent to Boston. And so the ship captain took this to the post office in Boston. You can see there's a Boston circular postmark at the left, and they put a ship mark, you can see the ship word marking in between the rate mark and the Boston CDS. And so the ordinary land rate between Boston and Philadelphia at that time was 18 3/4 cents. And so they added the 2-cent ship letter fee to that. And that's why you see that 20 in a squiggle, which is 20 3/4 cents. And so here's an example going in the other direction. This is a letter from Boston in 1848, and it was carried by the ship named Halifax to Halifax. And it got to Halifax 4 days later after the Boston date line, and it was rated 9 pence due, which is double the 4.5 pence rate for letters addressed to the port of arrival. And you can see off to the right, I have the ship letter marking, an image of the marking that's on the back of the letter. And so when you see a ship letter marking, you should always assume there's going to be a ship letter fee added on to the rate, or a special ship letter rate for the port of arrival. So next, I'll talk about the Falmouth packet. And so the Falmouth packet started in, I think it was around 1755 or so, but it didn't stop in Halifax. It used to go from Falmouth to New York. And so after the Revolutionary War, the British basically decided it wasn't a great idea to send all their communications, especially official government communications, to the remaining North American colonies through enemy territory. And so Halifax became a port in 1788, basically, for security reasons. And so if you were sending a letter to Montreal before the American Revolution from the United Kingdom, it went to New York and then up the Hudson River. After Halifax became the port, the mail would go to Halifax, and then it had to go overland from Halifax all the way to Montreal. There was an all, well, I'll call it all Canadian, all British North American route that went through Nova Scotia, New Brunswick into I guess Lower Canada at the time. So it was a long route. Typically could take longer to go from Halifax to Montreal than it took by sailing ship from Falmouth to Halifax. The routing of the Falmouth packet changed multiple times over the years, so there wasn't always a direct route between Halifax and the United States, and it was typically a monthly service, so it wasn't all that frequent. It was, it's designed to move mail between the United Kingdom and the North American colonies. The intent wasn't to provide for mail between, the US and Nova Scotia. And so here's an example of an early Falmouth packet letter through Halifax. Remember, the service started in 1788. This is 1789. And the letter was sent from the UK to New York. There's a week strike of a New York July 3 marking here. And in New York, they put the letter onto the Falmouth packet going from New York to Halifax, and then from there overland to St. John, New Brunswick. And actually you can see the address. It says New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, North America, because this was right after New Brunswick and Nova Scotia became separate colonies. And so the rates are added up at the top, and you can see it says packet from New York was 4 pence sterling, and then another 8 pence inland. And so that became 1 shilling, and then they converted it to 1 shilling 3.5 currency, because the 1 shilling was in sterling. And of course, at the time, Nova Scotia and New Brunswick had a local currency that was depreciated against sterling. Here's an example going in the other direction from Halifax to New York. And I've got reproduced on the side the Halifax origin postmark on the back. It's that big boxed Halifax, and it's a great strike of that marking, which is normally hit kind of off center a little and smudgy. And so this was paid 4.5 pence, and that's the currency equivalent of 4 pence sterling. And it was carried by the Falmouth packet Princess Royal to the US. And at that point, because it was coming in on a UK packet, they didn't charge an inland postage rate. In 1827, the Falmouth packets suspended service to New York due to competition from American packets that were operating between New York and Liverpool. And so the Falmouth packet began operating a service that was Falmouth to Halifax to Bermuda, back to Halifax and back to Falmouth. And so the Cunard Company operated mail boats between Halifax and Boston, basically to deliver the little bit of mail that was coming in on the Falmouth packet down to the United States. And I have been looking for years and not found a cover between Halifax and the United States carried by the Cunard mail boats. This is a cover from the UK that went on the Falmouth packet into Halifax, and in Halifax it got put on the Cunard mail boat down to Boston. And so this, you can see in the UK it was paid 2 shillings 3 pence at Liverpool, and that was the UK inland postage to Falmouth plus the Falmouth packet postage of 1 shilling. And then when it got to Boston, it was rated 27 cents due. And so that was going to Pittsburgh, which was over 400 miles. So the US inland was 25 cents plus 2 cents ship letter makes 27 cents due. And that's the 27 here. In 1840, the Cunard Line started operations, and the Liverpool to Boston ships called in Halifax from 1840 to the end of 1867. And when the Cunard Line started operating Liverpool to New York, the New York ships also called in Halifax from 1848 until 1850. And in 1850, they eliminated the stop in Halifax for the boats to New York, to speed them on the route, reduce the time between New York and Liverpool. And the mail between Halifax and the US was never covered by a postal treaty. And if you go and read the treaty between the United States and the United Kingdom, the 1848 treaty, it talks about how they intended to include mail between the US and Nova Scotia. And then they decided that it just was too complicated and said, we'll deal with it later, and it never got dealt with. The mail by Cunard Line from Nova Scotia to the US is pretty well known. It was, what do I want to say? The post office published the rates and everything. In the US, that wasn't the case. It was very little known in the US, and the United States postal laws and regulations didn't contain this, that you could send mail on this route until 1866. So if you were a business in Boston, there were private mailing guides that had this kind of information, and so the businesses knew about it. But for the most part, your individual correspondents didn't know this route existed. And the post offices, if you weren't in New York or Boston or Philadelphia, didn't really know about this route. In addition, the rates were fairly complex because you had US inland rates to get to the Cunard steamer at the port. Then there was the packet postage, and then also possibly inland postage in Nova Scotia. So each of those 3 rates changed multiple times over the period. And so there are a lot of different rate periods. This was also the mail route that was used primarily for mail between Newfoundland and the United States, and also for the little bit of mail to and from St. Pierre. In addition, there was a closed mail route between Montreal and Halifax that used the Cunard Line steamers. So here's my summary of the different rates applicable to Cunard Line mail between the US and Halifax. And there's, I think, 12 different rate periods over the 27 years. So here's the first rate period. It was 4 pence sterling packet postage. And this is a letter from Halifax. Again, the amount paid is expressed in currency, so it's 4.5 pence currency, representing the 4 pence sterling. And it's addressed to Boston, so it was charged the US ship letter rate for mail delivered to the port city, which is 6 cents. And that's there. And then the next rate period, what happened was the UK decided to increase the packet postage to £1. And so here's a letter from June of 45. And the interesting thing about this cover is that the packet postage was by weight. So it was one rate of packet postage, £1 to Boston. When it got to Boston, they decided it was a double letter because it was rated by the number of sheets. And so it was double 18 3/4, which is 37.5 cents, plus 2 cents ship letter fee is 39.5. The ship letter fee was one fee per letter. It wasn't a rate. So the ship letter rate, I'm sorry, the ship letter fee is not doubled. And so this is June of 45. July 1, the US changes its internal postage rates to simplify them to 5 cents up to 300 miles, 10 cents over 300 miles. And so this is the first stamped letter carried to Nova Scotia, New York Postmaster Provisional. And so it got to 5 cents, paid it from New York to Boston to put it on the Cunard steamer. And then the £1 sea postage was collected from the recipient in Halifax. And then in 1848, you have the retaliatory rate period. This is well known in the US. I don't know if the people up in BNA know it. So what happened was Cunard basically had a monopoly on steamship mail between the UK and the US. And so when the US had its first flagged steamship carrying mail to the UK, letters that were sent for I think it was the General Washington, the US charged 24 cents, which was the equivalent of £1, which was the postage by Cunard line. They charged 24 cents American packet postage to send the letter. And so when the General Washington got to Liverpool, the British marked every letter for British packet postage that hadn't been paid. And so, the Americans, if they sent a letter on the American steamer, they paid 24 cents, and then the recipient was charged another 24 cents. And if they sent a letter on the Cunard steamship, the British steamship, they paid 24 cents. And when it got to the UK, it was treated as prepaid. So the US protested this to the British. The British said, tough luck. And so the United States said, okay, we're going to charge a retaliatory rate. Any mail coming in on a British or British colony steamship is going to be treated as unpaid. And so here's a letter that was sent from Halifax in August of 48. And at Halifax, it was paid £1. And so it landed in Boston, and Boston said, oh, well, this is an unpaid packet letter. So we're charging you 24 cents American packet postage plus the 5 cents down to New York. So it was rated 29 cents due. The retaliatory rate letters from Nova Scotia are a little scarcer than the transatlantic retaliatory rate letters, because if you were in Halifax and you took it to the post office, and they're going to charge you 24, it's going to cost you £1. And when it gets to New York, they're going to charge you another £1 packet postage. You could just send it overland and avoid this. And so a lot of the mail wound up being routed overland. I've even got a letter or two where it says, by steam or whatever, and then it's lined out and says overland. So this was the retaliatory rate period that led to the treaty between the US and the UK. And you'll notice this letter looks a lot like the others, except they stopped charging ship letter fees. So it's rated 5 cents due instead of 7 cents due, which was the 5 cent rate plus 2 cent ship letter fee. Then the UK reduced the packet postage from 1 shilling back to 4 pence sterling. So here's a letter from the US, and the squiggle there in the center is an 11.5 pence due, which was 4.5 pence currency packet postage plus 7 pence inland, which gets you to the 11.5 pence due. In 1851, the US postage rates, domestic postage rate declined to 3 cents. And so here's a letter paying the ordinary 3-cent domestic letter rate, and it gets charged 5 pence currency because there was a further depreciation in the Nova Scotia currency against sterling. The actual postage rate in sterling was unchanged at 4 pence. And so then sometime in 1854, the US started charging 5 cents on these letters instead of 3 cents. And there was something under the British treaty that they referred, it's called the British Open Mail Rate. And it was basically 5 cents to put a letter on a canard steamship if it was going to some other European country. If you were sending a letter to, I don't know, the Netherlands from the US, you had to pay the 5 cent, which was the US portion of the treaty rate between the US and the UK, and then Great Britain would carry it to the final destination. And for whatever, because Nova Scotia wasn't covered under the treaty, it wasn't one of the countries that the open mail rate applied to. So you could put a letter on the steamship to all these foreign countries for 5 cents, but for Nova Scotia it was 3 cents. And I think that, at some point the post office just decided this was silly and said we're going to start charging 5 cents on the letters to Nova Scotia, but nobody has ever found the government direction on this. And I actually went to the National Archives and went through the government letter order book and couldn't find anything. But sometime in 1854, they made this change. And you'll see the letters after that date are prepaid 5 cents from the US. And here's just a pretty cover in the other direction, paying the 5 pence packet postage rate from Nova Scotia to the US. And when it arrives in Boston, it's treated as an unpaid letter and charged 5 cents postage due. And then here's the same thing, but with a Nova Scotia inland postage added onto it. So it was 5 pence for the packet, 3 pence inland is 8. And so this is a 6 pence plus 2 1-pence stamps. This is actually the only 8 pence packet rate cover with the 6 pence dark green stamp. I think there's about 6 or so covers paying the 8 pence rate with Nova Scotia first issue stamps. In 1860, Nova Scotia converted to cents, decimal currency. And so 4 pence sterling was 8.5 pence in decimal currency. So this is paying the same rate, but in the decimal equivalent. In 1863, Halifax decided, we're doing a lot of work on these letters and we're not making anything on it. And so they said, we're going to charge 1.5 cents on letters, to or from, canard letters to or from Halifax. So instead of 8.5, the rate became 10 cents. And so here's with a Nova Scotia 10-cent stamp. And again, when it lands in the US in Boston, Boston charges 5 cents as an unpaid letter. The decimal rate, that penny and a half didn't apply to mail beyond Halifax. So it was 8.5 plus 5 is 13.5 cents. And this is a letter that was carried by Canard Line and sent to San Francisco. This was after the US, there used to be a special rate to California and across the Rockies rate. but this was after that rate was eliminated, so it was 5 cents in Boston. There's this is a whole correspondence, this Scott correspondence to San Francisco, and most of the letters are sent overland, but there are 2 or 3 kind of right in a row that were sent by Cunard Line between Nova Scotia and the U.S. But anyway, this is an overpayment of 1.5 pennies on the 13.5 cent rate. And then I mentioned the closed mail. And so here's an example of the closed mail between Halifax and Montreal. It was 7.5 pence currency, which is the equivalent of 6 pence sterling, which is the 4 pence sterling packet rate, and 2 pence sterling, a special inland rate on packet letters. There's only, I think, 4 covers with paying this rate with the first issue Nova Scotia stamps. And again, this is the only one with the 6 pence dark green. And then this is an example going in the other direction during the decimal period. The 7.5 currency became 12.5 cents currency. And this is, again, an example from Montreal to Nova Scotia. I mentioned that this was generally the way mail between the United States and Newfoundland was carried. And so here's an example with the 8 pence bisect paying the 4 pence rate, 4 pence sterling. And this is also the way that the little bit of mail that went between the United States and Saint Pierre, the mail went by the Cunard Line as far as Halifax, and then at Halifax there was a feeder route that went from Halifax. It stopped in Sydney and then went on to St. John's, Newfoundland. And so the mail to Saint Pierre was routed via Sydney, and then there was a French packet that went from Saint Pierre to Sydney. And so here you have a letter with basically four different postal systems in it. So the US, this originated in New York. It doesn't have a rate mark on it, but it would have been 5 cents to take it to the Cunard steamer to Halifax. At Halifax, it got hit with the 8 pence due, which was the rate beyond Halifax for the Cunard Line. They put it on the steamer to Sydney. At Sydney, I believe, the 8 pence was ignored and they charged 10 pence. They basically said, because this is going to a foreign country, we're charging 2 packet rates instead of 1. And so that 10 pence currency was paid by the French packet at Sydney, and they converted that to 1 franc, and then they charged 25 centimes for the transit from Sydney to Saint Pierre. And so this marking up here is a 1 franc 25 centime due mark. Sorry, my kids are texting and I turned off the ringer and it's still dinging. So it's 1 franc 25 centimes due. So you have a French packet, you have the feeder route, which is run by Nova Scotia, I believe. You have the Cunard Line UK packet, and then you have the US postage on this one cover. The next route is the Sir John Harvey. And so there was a steamer operating a scheduled service between Halifax and Boston starting in July of 1852. And the US and Nova Scotia started negotiating a postal agreement that was supposed to take effect in December of 1852. There was a dispute between the US and the UK where the US wanted to include mails to Newfoundland and Prince Edward Island. into the agreement, and the postmaster in Nova Scotia says, hey, those are other countries, I can't agree to that. And so it kind of went back and forth. And this was, basically during the last days of the Fillmore administration. He was voted out of office, and you had a new president from a different party coming in, and this just kind of fell by the wayside. But Nova Scotia apparently thought they had an agreement, and so they sent mail at the proposed treaty rate on 3 sailings of the Sir John Harvey in early 1853. And there are 4 covers recorded with the Nova Scotia Scroll Exchange Office marking. The US never sent any mail to Nova Scotia under this proposed treaty. And if you read, like Jeffcott and a lot of the BNA sources, they say, oh, well, so little mail was carried that they terminated the agreement. But I went actually to the archives in Halifax and found that, okay, they never reached this agreement. There's correspondence saying, hey, we're sending mail by mailbag, and you're not sending any mail to us. And so what happened was, I found in the old Halifax newspapers that the owners of the ship, Clark Jones and Co., actually abandoned the route and sent the ship to Australia in 1853, early 1853, and that's why the service ended. And so here's an example in 1852, before the proposed agreement, and it's just treated as a ship letter. It's 5 cents US internal postage plus the 2-cent ship letter fee. And you can see at the bottom left, it says steamer Sir John Harvey. And then here's an example with the Nova Scotia Scroll, where the stuff came in, bagged and marked 10 cents due. And the US Post Office, I guess, just said, hey, we were going to charge 7. It says to collect 10, we'll collect 10. And so this is the only, that's the only Nova Scotia Exchange Office marking for mail to the United States. In 1857, there was a company called the North Atlantic Steam Navigation Company. It operated, I think, 8 voyages between Liverpool and Portland, Maine. The primary purpose of this steamship route was to provide mail service between St. John's, Newfoundland, direct to the UK. But since they were heading in this direction, they added a stop in Halifax also. There are 3 covers known carried on this steamship line, and here is the only one between the United States and Halifax. The Kersonese from Halifax to Portland in July of 57. Nova Scotia charged a 4.5 pence outgoing ship letter fee. In Portland, they hit it with the steam marking, and it should have been charged 5 cents due as an unpaid letter, but there's no US postage marked due on it. There's another company called the Boston and Colonial Steamship Company. It operated every 2 weeks between Boston and Charlottetown, PEI, and it had a couple intermediate stops, including Halifax, starting in May or June of 1864. The US entered into a mail contract with the company. By this point in 1864, there aren't a lot of transit markings on the back of letters, so it's hard to identify these as definitively having been carried by Boston and Colonial Steamship Company instead of going, up via St. John, New Brunswick, and that overland through there. But the absence of transit marks can be an indication. Here's a cover, August of 1864, and it's endorsed for the steamer Commerce. And I actually bought this cover just because I wanted an example of, it was paid 10 cents, but the treaty between the US and the Maritimes said that partial payments aren't recognized. So this was a double weight letter. And so they ignored the payment of the 10 cents and marked it 20 cents due. Here's another example of a cover carried on the Boston and Colonial Steamship Company. Again, endorsed per steamer commerce. And then the last route I want to talk about is the International Steamship Company, often referred to as the Grand Trunk Railway route. They carried mail by closed bag between Montreal and Halifax. It was by rail from Montreal to Portland, Maine, and then steamship from Portland, Maine to Halifax. The service started in October of 1866. The B&A sources are conflicting. Some say the rate was 12.5 cents. Some say the rate was 5 cents. I'm aware of one pre-Confederation cover that I think was carried on the route, but I'm not not 100% certain on it. But the route did carry mail, and there's post-Confederation mail easily known to have been carried on the route. And this is the one cover that I think was carried that way. It's endorsed per express via Portland. The transit marks and the dates are all consistent with a Grand Trunk Railway routing, and it pretty much rules out any alternative routing. But the rate doesn't match the reported rates. It's rated 10 cents due. Now that could just be a rating error. It could be double 5 cents. But it's the closest I've found in looking for 20 years for one of these. And here, this is the one cover in the slideshow that I don't own. This is just an example showing mail carried on that route. The Carlotta was the Grand Trunk Railway steamship that was tied into that route. And so this is a letter from Portland to Halifax that was clearly carried on that route after Confederation. And so that's it. Thank you. And I just point out for anybody that hasn't seen the articles that I've written, you can access them for free on the USPCS webpage. If you click on the resources tab, and then there's a link for Search the Chronicle, you can pull up that and other articles.
That's great, David. Wow, what a wonderful presentation. Fascinating stuff and just amazing material. So thank you for that. Do we have any questions? Anyone like to ask a question? I don't see any in the chat.
Not a question, but thank you very much. That, as Greg said, was a fascinating analysis of what to me are incredibly complicated rates, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
I would say the same. I thought rates between San Francisco and Victoria were complex, but this is beyond the pale. Thanks an awful lot, David.
Thank you.
Yeah, David, again, I'm echoing what everybody else said, but maybe one quick question from your, because my interest is specifically early Fredericton, New Brunswick postal history. And I do have a number of Montreal to Fredericton via Portland, but without any other additional markings for either the steamship or for that, covering some of the periods you were mentioning. I'm just wondering if you had insights into that.
That would have gone by, there was another closed mail route.
Yeah.
That went from Montreal to Portland, and then it connected to the coastal steamship up to St. John, New Brunswick. So it would have gone that way to St. John and then overland from St. John to Fredericton.
Yeah, I've got one with Steamboat St. John to Fredericton, but I've also got one that doesn't indicate that. So I'm just curious.
Yeah, initially the rules were that it had to be marked via Portland and St. John. And I've never seen any guidance that was no longer required, but I think they just started sending the mail that way by default, rather than sending it on the long overland route over northern Maine and then down through Woodstock.
Right.
I mean, if you got a
Okay.
Woodstock transit marking, it went overland. If you don't,
Yeah.
it probably went via St. John and.
Yeah, well, no, I've got a number of the Woodstock transits, but just now the couple without those, at least two without the extra markings. I'm just curious, but that closed. I think that answered the question well. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
David, a question from Joan Harmer. She wondered if we'll be making the slides available. We don't have a way to be able to display them, but I wonder if you would be willing to put your email in the chat in case anybody would like to request the.
Sure, I can tell Joan I'll email a copy to her after we end this. I can put it in the chat.
That's great. I was going to say that's better service than they even got from New York to Halifax. Pretty great. Terrific. Well, David, thank you so much for what really was an incredibly interesting topic. Whether one collects this or not, your knowledge of it is really astounding. And I agree on the complexity of the rates, which is just I think a full-time job pretty much to figure that out. So thank you. What a great way to begin the day. I just wanted to remind you that the next session will begin at 1:30, and it'll be Kevin O'Reilly who'll be speaking about Fool's Gold, Labrador's mining rushes. So we hope you'll join us for that. Thanks again.